If you want to understand where real estate may be heading next, there's one story you should be watching very closely right now. And it's not just mortgage rates, inventory, or home prices. It's buyer agreements. More specifically, it's the growing divide between what the industry has treated as the new post-settlement playbook and what some states are now saying should actually happen in practice. For the last year and a half, a lot of agents and brokers have been operating under a fairly simple understanding. If you're working with a buyer, you need to get a written agreement signed before touring a home. That message came from the practice changes tied to the NAR settlement, and the published policy says that unless inconsistent with state or federal law, MLS participants working with a buyer must enter into a written agreement with the buyer before touring a home. That agreement also has to clearly disclose compensation, say that compensation cannot be open-ended, and state that commissions are fully negotiable. That became the working script for a huge part of the industry. But now we're seeing something important happen. State law is starting to push back. In Alabama, changes reflected by the Alabama Real Estate Commission say that under Act 2025-59, effective April 18, 2025, a consumer or customer may not be required to enter into a written brokerage agreement just to be shown a property. And in Mississippi, this issue just got more attention because Mississippi's SB 2713 was approved by the governor on March 13th of 26. Housing Wire reported that the law allows buyers to tour homes without a signed buyer agency agreement in certain situations, while still requiring a brokerage agreement before listing a property or submitting an offer where compensation is involved. Now, let's pause there because this is the heart of it. The big point is that the industry may no longer be moving toward one universal standard. That matters because so many brokerages have spent the last year trying to standardize forms and training, consultation language, agent onboarding, compliance systems, and buyer education around a more uniform interpretation of the post-settlement world. And now, the market may be telling us something completely different. The next phase of buyer representation could be much more state by state than many people expected. So why should agents care? Because this affects the very first conversation with a buyer. It affects how you explain representation. It explains when paperwork comes up and what buyers think they may be asked to commit to. And it affects how much trust you build in the first 5 minutes of the relationship. His own consumer-facing guidance tries to help explain this by saying buyers are asked to enter into a written buyer agreement before touring a home with their agent, but not when they're simply visiting an open house on their own or asking an agent about services. That distinction is important, but it is also part of why consumers are confused. They hear one rule in the headline, then a different exception in practice. And now in some states, they may hear something completely different. That confusion is not just a compliance problem. It's a branding problem and a communication problem. Because when consumers do not understand the process, they assume the industry is making it up as they go. And whether that is fair or not, that is a perception agents and brokers have to manage. This is why I think the firms that will gain the most from this moment are not necessarily the biggest firms or the ones that are thickest manuals. The firms that can say, here is how it works in our state. Here's when an agreement is required. Here is what it means. Here is what is negotiable, and here are the services you're getting. Here is what you are this is a lot of here's. Here is what you are not locked into unless the agreement says so. And here is why we are having this conversation up front. This is the kind of clarity that builds trust. And in a market where consumers are already overwhelmed by affordability, rates, inventory, and headlines, trust is not a soft skill. It's a hard competitive advantage. There's another reason that this matters. It's not just about serving buyers better, it's also about brokerage operations. If laws and regulations start diverging more and more, state by state, brokerages can no longer treat buyer representation as one blanket national workflow. They need market-specific training. They need state-specific scripts. They need clean consultation processes. And they need internal guidance that helps agents understand not just what form to use, but how to explain the form, how to discuss compensation, and how to handle the conversation without sounding defensive or vague. It also creates a recruiting angle. Agents want to work where the business feels understandable and support feels real. The brokerage leaves agents guessing, and if one brokerage leaves agents guessing and another gives them clear language, simple systems, and real answers, that second brokerage becomes much easier to join and much easier to stay with. So when people look at this story and think it's just about paperwork timing, I think they're missing the bigger picture. This is about operational leadership. It's about consumer communication And it's about whether the brokerage community is going to react to these changes or get ahead of them. And it's also about whether we're entering a new phase where housing laws, brokerage rules, and consumer expectations are going to be shaped more locally than nationally. Housing Wire reported that other states have also considered similar legislation, while places like Texas and Oregon have moved towards stricter written agreement frameworks. That tells me this is probably not the end of the story. It's probably the beginning of a much wider debate. So here's what the practical takeaway is. If you're an agent, stop treating the buyer agreement conversation like a hurdle. Treat it like an opportunity to demonstrate professionalism. If you're a broker or team leader, stop assuming compliance language alone will solve this. Build consumer-friendly explanations and state-specific training. And if you create content in this industry, pay attention to this story because the search demand around this topic is only going to grow. People want to know, do I have to sign a buyer agreement? Can I tour a home without one? What changed after the NAR settlement? What does my state require? These are real search questions. Those are answer engine questions. And the professionals who answer them clearly are going to win attention and trust. This is why I believe the buyer agreement laws could become one of the biggest real estate business stories of 2026. Not because they're dramatic, because they directly affect how real estate gets done.